Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and as you may remember, I did a 16-part video series on the Russo-Ukrainian War that we see unfolding before us within the first month of its start. And while I covered any number of topics that might arise from a discussion about this war, there is one point that I don't think I really talked about at any point, and it's also something that I was aware of and probably should have made a video about in that series, but it was running pretty long as it was. And since I didn't, I might as well make that video now. And that is the impact that this war and the disruption of trade that it will cause will have on the global economy. This video will be a bit of a simplification of that because it is a pretty complicated topic to talk about. But I am going to try to hit the high notes here and kind of tell you what maybe you should be most concerned about. I did talk at length about the sanctions, and I did talk at length about oil, and that is also an important part of this picture as well. But what I didn't mention is that Ukraine supplies a vast amount of the world's grain. Mostly wheat, but other grains as well, and a lot of other countries are actually dependent on these, especially if they don't have internal agriculture programs that are sufficient to feed their people. In addition to having some of the most fertile grounds in the world, Russia and Ukraine also produce a lot of the world's fertilizer chemicals, which allow for advanced gardening operations and industrial farming in places that make enough food to feed their own country, as well as export some of the extra food to these other countries I just mentioned who are dependent on it. It's also worth noting that a number of our fertilizers are derived from petroleum, which, as I said before, oil is very much tied up in the middle of this, any way you look at it. At the time, it felt like a consequence that would only be really impactful if the war continued on. But it has drug on since those videos were released, and the lack of fertilizer and surplus grain supplies to certain parts of the world have already been devastating. Now, as an American writing for what I imagine to be an American audience, it would be very easy for me to talk about the ways that inflation in the United States are making a bad situation worse for a lot of people in the middle to lower class. But the thing is, you're already probably pretty aware of that. You've already heard other American commentators talking about this already, for certain, because I've heard so many myself. I just can't imagine that you haven't heard someone talking about this. The only thing that I really think that this video can add to that particular American discussion is to show us the extent to which this is not a local phenomenon. There are a lot of people who want to bring the blame against the president and his administration for this. And don't get me wrong, there are numerous things that could have been done better, numerous ways that they might have been able to stem the bleeding here and really support the lower and middle class while this whole incident is going on, that they didn't do. But at the same time, if we're looking for a cause of these problems in the United States, we should more look to this as a global wave that is crashing on everyone's shores simultaneously. Because while it simply laps at ours, it can be a devastating tsunami in other parts of the world. One of the reasons, now, I think that it's really easy for us to look at the news as a way of answering the question, what should I be concerned about affecting me? And in this respect, how the rest of the world fares through this crisis isn't really relevant. But I think that we need a global sense to know what injustices are happening in the world because we live in a country that has global power and influence. This may be because of the invisible empire that we have built both through corporate extensions of American power as well as military extensions of American power, and whether we like it or not, we do bear a responsibility in wielding this power. Even if we, the American people, didn't ask for it and don't want it, we have it. Therefore, we must act with our privilege. And therefore, we especially, more so than any other country in the world needs to know about world affairs, need to understand what our country is actually doing across the world. And also, importantly, what it's not doing. One of the reasons that I didn't know this was going to be impactful, and one of the reasons why it might not be impactful if this was a short war, is that in terms of fertilizer, it's not going to be impactful until a new growing season starts and all of a sudden supplies start running low. When the war started, many places already had stuff in the ground or already had enough fertilizer on hand or within their local economies to deal with the next growing season. But as the war turns into a 3-month war, turns into a 6-month war and longer, this would start to pile up the long-term effects as suddenly supplies start running low and there's nowhere to restock them from. We stand chronologically in the middle of that process right now. But the thing that I wasn't necessarily anticipating was that the grain that was already in Ukraine would become so hard to get out. And it was because there were a lot of borders of Ukraine that seemed to open to be able to helping keep this trade to the outside world as they were being attacked from their Russian and Belarusian borders. However, in the intervening time since I wrote that video series, Russia has mounted a naval blockade, which is perhaps most importantly preventing food from reaching Africa. Africa doesn't employ a lot of modern techniques in their farming and doesn't have a modern industrial farming network. In addition to that, Africa is not particularly fertile at this time in history. So, naturally, many African countries are dependent on outside grain to feed their populations. It would, at the very least, take wide-scale use of fertilizer for Africa to begin to become self-sufficient where they're currently at. Although this is the other thing that is being blocked by the war and this blockade. This will very rapidly lead to people starving in those countries, especially at the uppermost region of Africa around Egypt and Sri Lanka, which is the part of Africa that is closest to the trading partners of Russia and Ukraine. It's also worth noting that because of the increasing devastation caused by adverse weather events as a result of global climate change, that a lot of places that are doing all right now, especially with a limited supply of fertilizer, in their future, if this war continues, might be in a precarious place where just one bad storm or a bad growing season could ruin everything for them. And if this happens to enough countries simultaneously due to a widespread weather event, this could create a situation where a lot of countries that currently are export capable and can fulfill the needs of some of these other countries, perhaps acting as backup sources of grain now, especially the ones that are least dependent on trade to fulfill their country's nutritional requirements as it stands. Once these countries start to cease exporting and hoarding their own production to keep their own people fed, we could have a situation where the supply chain just falls apart like a house of cards. And the stress of this naval blockade is currently a very big part of it, even though the war itself is posing a long-term problem as well. And if the war were to go on, there might be a chance of repairing a bit of this damage if there were not, say, a naval blockade. And it's worth pointing out that this blockade is effectively a military-based sanction on a large portion of the world. Vladimir Putin is so desperate to win this war that he is willing to starve a large amount of it in order to achieve his goals. And of course, these actions will have rippling effects that wash like waves onto our shores as well. This is the very real threat of counter-sanctions that I mentioned when I was talking about sanctions in the original conflict and how quickly we escalated our sanctions. But, unable to target America directly, it seems that the Kremlin has decided to instead hold large portions of the world and their diet hostage. This is a massive global crisis any way you look at it. And the effects that we're feeling here in America are comparatively subtle and no true reflection of what some of these countries are going through. I also think this offers America a great opportunity. We already produce so much and have so much aid money floating around the world that if we were to redirect some of this aid and some of that aid through large donations of food purchased from our farmers to the countries that need it the most, I think that we would gain a lot of goodwill in the same way that I think that socialists should help people in their neighborhood first, because of these direct connections are the most impactful ones. This is also a similar way to do this on a global scale. Coming to a future ally's aid in their time of need is exactly what might make them a future ally. Do we have the will to save the rest of the world? Or has neoliberal poisoned us such that we cannot imagine anything outside of our own survival? Are we bad enough dudes to do what it might take to push for this type of international policy that might help a struggling third world, which is only going to be further impacted as a war like this continues to rage on, but also as we continue to not do enough about the global climate change problem that we are embroiled in? Well, one of the first things that we could do as a country is to take that problem seriously, because this is definitely a part of the equation here. And to any degree that we can give the world a softer transition into its climate future instead of driving all gas, no brakes into the apocalypse, we should absolutely do that. But to do so, we must force our local representatives to act in the benefit of those people who need it the most. And to circle back to another crisis with millions of people starving that I have mentioned as a part of this series, actually pretty early on, we could give Afghanistan the money to not starve their people now. American officials may be unsure whether or not they will actually use it to put food in mothers' mouths or not, but the only thing that we can be certain about now is that mothers are starving, and they cannot feed them if we never give them their money back. At the very least, giving them their money back allows us to wash our hands of the responsibility to do so, because at the moment, withholding these funds is just putting blood on them. It would be a pretty easy fix compared to some of the larger global hunger crises that I've mentioned earlier in this video. So there are things that we can do. There are things that we can advocate for. But also, if you truly believe that advocating to our government will not actually solve these problems, then what you need to do is start building up the sort of networks that will be able to come together to solve these problems without requiring state intervention. See, the thing that makes communism specifically cool is that it imagines a world in which our social structures have been built up democratically and have so much ability to help those under its charge that a state is no longer required. So I guess what I'm saying is that you can either start calling your politicians or knocking on your neighbor's door. One way or the other, we need the influence that it would take to make our country take these sorts of things seriously. If you have any fun ideas about how we might be able to rally influence in America in support of these causes, feel free to let me know in the comments. And if you would like to support this type of content in the future, hit me up on Patreon or Ko-fi. Those links will be in the description. Because I really think that even though I'm a small channel, if I have the guts to really address the elephant in the room, globally speaking, to an American audience that's still possessed by the American dream, that we might start waking some more people up from its hypnotic spell. And once enough of us are awake, maybe we can actually start taking charge of our country again and pull the world from the brink of annihilation. Anyways, that's my hopeful future, couched painfully in reality. If you want to become a part of a network that is trying to bring socialism to your neighborhood, feel free to join my Discord, Slay the Behemoth.commie, which aims, at least the first aim that I would like to give this group is to create an international list of socialist and communist organizations that might be operating in your neighborhood and ways to reach out to them and find out if there's any way that you can help them locally. I think that if we could utilize this sort of highly motivated volunteerism and bridge the gap of knowledge by using the internet to connect people with these volunteer networks, that we would be a hell of a lot more effective in the streets. And until we are, it's hard to really have a real hope that we can change big issues like this. But I do hope that we can come together to the extent where we can have that power. Anyways, that's not entirely up to me. It's up to you as well. Thanks for listening.